Rodney and I had the same birthday. Same day, same year. And so right off, we hit it off. And everyone liked Rodney. He seemed to have it all. He was good looking. His blended silver and dark hair was always in place. His fingernails were manicured. He had an all-year tan. He wore a Rolex watch and enough jewelry that you knew he had money and lots of it. But he was generous with his money. He was always buying expensive gifts for his friends. Rodney was friendly to everyone, and he smiled a lot. He was married with a 5-year-old son whom he adored. And at 30-something years old, he was the picture of success. Everything seemed to be going for Rodney. But even a stranger could tell all was not well with him, because his pasted-on smile looked a little too forced, and he always seemed as if he was going to break down and cry at any moment. And if you were within his circle of friends, you would have known that Rodney was an alcoholic that just couldn't manage to stay sober, having been in and out of treatment centers so many times that even Rodney had lost count. No, all was definitely not well with Rodney. You see, Rodney was gay, and he just couldn't manage to resolve that part of him with the spiritual part of him. He couldn't grasp the idea that his sexual orientation had no bearing on his value to God and to others. Rodney felt he was every bit the abomination that had been preached to him over the years. Even though he was the picture of success, Rodney was a broken man. He felt dirty. His spiritual life was in deep need of healing. I thought of Rodney when I read this morning's passage from the 5th chapter of the book of 2 Kings. The commander-in-chief of the Aramean army reminded me a lot of Rodney. Naaman was a military success. You might think of him as a combination of Patton, John Wayne, and MacArthur all rolled into one. He was wealthy, influential, and a military champion. But even though he was the picture of success, he was still miserable. You see, Naaman was a leper. Now, when the Bible talks about leprosy, it's not necessarily referring to what we know today as leprosy, which goes by the name of Hansen's disease. Leprosy was a general term that could refer to any kind of skin disorder, like a rash, a skin fungus, or psoriasis. And although it may not have been fatal, it was still an awful disease to have in ancient times because of the stigma that was attached to it. It was widely assumed that leprosy was a punishment for some sort of sin, and so the person was declared to be unclean. And people who were labeled as unclean generally had to live apart from everyone else outside the city gates so others wouldn't be contaminated. However, Naaman's prestige seemed to exclude him from this sort of extreme measure. But his leprosy nonetheless must have had its effect on him. The stares of others, the snickers and crude jokes that he pretended to ignore, the strategic arrangement of his place setting away from the other dinner guests. Even though Naaman seemed to have it all, even though he was the picture of success, Naaman suffered. Like my friend Rodney, Naaman was a broken man. He felt dirty, and he was in deep need of healing. Our world is also in deep need of healing. Wherever we look, wherever we go, we will find brokenness. Around the block, there are people who have been pushed to the outside. They are hungry and dispossessed. Our world is fractured, and within our own country and across our borders, there is a need for healing. The poor are everywhere. We have forgotten God's commandment to show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the orphan, the alien, or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. War and politics and greed continue to make the world an ugly, unclean place for millions of people. Even though you and I live in the comfort and freedom of a democracy like the United States of America, whose birthday we celebrate today, most of our world is just as broken as was Rodney and just as blemished as Naaman. But there is hope. There is always hope. A hope that comes from God. But in this morning's story, there seemed to be some confusion about the source of hope. The servant girl of Naaman's wife seemed to think that the prophet Elisha was the source of healing. She said to her mistress, "If only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." And when Naaman told his king about the chance for healing, the king of Aram sent a letter to the king of Israel, which seemed to imply the king of Israel would perform the cure. When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you my servant Naaman, that you may cure him of his leprosy. No one seemed to get it. No one understood that healing comes from God. If we ever hope to experience wholeness in this world, it's not going to be in the catchy words of mission and vision statements. We can immerse ourselves in core values and strategic plans, and if those statements and strategies aren't centered in the idea that we are all members of God's family, there is never going to be healing. The mayor, the governor, and the President of the United States can produce as many proclamations as they wish, but they are nothing more than ink on paper. The only way this world is ever going to be fixed is when we open ourselves to God as the source of healing.